Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm sharing a story that you might have actually lived through yourself, and trust me, it's a love story. Are you ready? Let's go! She had owned that coffee shop for 11 years and thought she had seen everything. Until the morning, she finally asked him why he never smiled. What he told her that day was something so private, so painful, that she sat down right there behind the counter and cried for the very first time in years. Oh girls, pour yourself a cup of something warm because I have to tell you about a story that has been sitting in my heart for weeks now, and I just cannot keep it to myself any longer. You know how sometimes you hear something about two people and it just stops you completely, like you have to put down whatever you are doing and just sit with it for a moment? That is exactly what happened to me when I first heard about Margaret and the young man she came to know as Daniel. I think about these two all the time now. And I think once you hear what I am about to tell you, you will understand why. Margaret was 57 years old, and she had spent the last 11 years of her life inside that little coffee shop on the corner of Northwest 23rd Avenue in Portland, Oregon. The place was called Morning Light, and if you had ever walked in there on a cold Tuesday morning, you would have understood immediately why people kept coming back. It was not just the coffee, though Margaret roasted her own beans and took more pride in that than in almost anything else. It was the feeling of the place. The worn wooden floors, the mismatched chairs, the old jazz records she played just low enough that you could still hear yourself think. Margaret had built something real there. Something that felt like it belonged to the neighborhood the same way the old oak trees on the sidewalk did. But Margaret herself was carrying something quiet and heavy those days. Something she did not talk about with her regulars or her part-time employees. 3 years earlier, her husband of 22 years had sat across from her at their kitchen table and told her very calmly that he had not been happy for a long time. He was not cruel about it. He was not angry. He was just honest in the way that sometimes hurts more than any amount of yelling ever could. And just like that, the life she had built alongside the coffee shop began to come apart at the edges. She kept the shop. She kept her apartment a few blocks away. She kept her routines. But something inside her had gone very quiet, and she had stopped expecting anything surprising from her days. That is when Daniel walked in for the first time. It was a Wednesday morning in late October, and Portland was doing what Portland does best in the fall, which is wrap the whole city in a kind of gray, soft light that makes everything feel a little like a dream. Daniel came in just before 7 in the morning, when the shop was still mostly empty. He was 29 years old, though Margaret did not know that yet. What she noticed first was how he moved, carefully, like someone who was always aware of taking up too much space. He was tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of young man that most people would look at and immediately assume had an easy life. He had dark brown hair and dark eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been set with some kind of permanent tension in it. He ordered a black coffee, found the corner table by the window, and sat down alone. He opened no phone, he read no book. He just sat there and watched the street outside with an expression that Margaret could only describe later as a kind of deep practiced stillness. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Within 2 weeks, he was the most consistent regular she had. He always arrived at the same time, always ordered the same thing, always took the same corner table. He was unfailingly polite, always said please and thank you, always left a generous tip. But he never smiled, not once. Margaret noticed it the way you notice something that should be there and is not. Like a picture hook on a wall with no picture. Other customers smiled at her, at each other, at their phones, at nothing in particular. Daniel just did not. And Margaret, who had spent 11 years learning how to read the people who came through her door, found herself thinking about him more than made any practical sense. She started paying attention to the small things. He always wore simple, clean clothes, nothing expensive, but nothing careless either. He always had a slight hesitation before he spoke, as if he was carefully choosing each word before releasing it into the air. When the shop got crowded and loud, she noticed that he would wrap both hands around his coffee cup like he was steadying himself. Once, a little girl at the table next to him dropped her stuffed rabbit on the floor, and before her mother could even react. And Daniel had quietly picked it up and placed it back on the table without a word. The little girl beamed at him. He looked at her gently, nodded once, and turned back to the window. Still no smile. It was a Thursday morning in December, about 6 weeks after he had first walked in, when Margaret finally said something. The shop was quiet. The other two customers at the back were deep in their laptops. Margaret brought Daniel his coffee herself instead of leaving it on the counter, which she did not usually do. And she stood there for just a moment and said, very simply, "You know, I have been watching you come in here every morning for almost 2 months now, and I do not think I have ever seen you smile even once. Is everything all right with you?" She said it the way a person says something when they genuinely want to know the answer and are not just making conversation. Daniel looked up at her, and something in his face shifted, not much, just enough for her to see that the question had landed somewhere real. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said quietly that it was a long story. And Margaret, who had nowhere particular to be, and a coffee shop to run, but a heart that had been looking for something to care about for 3 years, pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. What he told her over the next 40 minutes was something she had never heard before and has not been able to forget since. Daniel had grown up in a very small town in rural Oregon, the eldest of 4 children, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs and loved them fiercely but was simply never there. From the time he was 11 years old, Daniel had been the one responsible for his younger siblings after school. He cooked dinner, he helped with homework, he made sure everyone got to bed. He had done this without complaint for 7 years, and by the time he left for college on a partial scholarship, he had spent so much of his youth being the steady one, the responsible one, the one who held everything together, that he had never actually learned how to just exist without a purpose. He had never learned how to simply be easy with himself. And then there was the other thing, the thing that Daniel spoke about in a lower voice, looking at his coffee cup rather than at Margaret. When he was 19, he had been in a relationship with a young woman he cared about deeply. Things had become serious. And when a certain kind of intimacy had arrived in that relationship, the young woman had reacted with what Daniel could only describe as genuine fear, and had ended things immediately, telling him that he was simply too much, that she could not handle it. He had been 20 years old and completely blindsided, and the experience had left a mark on him that he had carried quietly ever since. In the 9 years that followed, every time he had allowed himself to get close to someone, he had eventually arrived at that same moment, and the outcome had always been the same. And so somewhere along the way, Daniel had simply stopped trying. He had accepted, in the quiet and private part of himself where these decisions get made, that he was not built for the kind of love that other people seem to find easily. Margaret sat across from him and listened to every word, and when he finished, she did not offer him reassurance or advice or any of the things people usually rush to offer when someone tells them something painful. She just looked at him for a moment and said, "I am really glad you told me that." And she meant it completely. That was the beginning of something that neither of them had a name for, and neither of them tried to rush. Margaret started saving him the corner table. Daniel started arriving a little earlier. The conversations grew longer. Some mornings they talked about serious things, his work as a freelance graphic designer, her memories of building the shop from nothing, the particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from feeling unseen inside a life that looks fine from the outside. Other mornings, they just sat together in comfortable quiet while the shop filled up around them, and the rain came down on Northwest 23rd Avenue, and the jazz played low on the old speakers, and everything felt, for both of them, just a little less heavy than it had before. It was a Tuesday morning in late February when Margaret arrived at the shop before dawn to start the roasting and found a small envelope tucked under the front door. Inside was a hand-drawn card, and on the front of it Daniel had drawn, in careful ink lines, a tiny version of her coffee shop with the lights on in the dark. Inside, in his careful, deliberate handwriting, he had written just one line. He wrote that she was the first person in a very long time who had made him feel like himself was enough. That was all. But Margaret stood there in her empty shop in the dark of a February morning and held that card against her chest and cried in the way that people cry when something they had stopped believing in turns out to still be real. Girls, I think about Margaret and Daniel a lot. Not because their story is dramatic or because it has some perfect ending tied up in a bow. I think about them because of what it reminds me. It reminds me that the people who seem the most closed off are sometimes just the ones who have been carrying something alone for too long. It reminds me that one honest question, one genuine moment of seeing someone, can open a door that has been shut for years. Margaret was 57 years old and she had convinced herself that the surprising parts of her life were behind her. Daniel was 29 and had quietly decided he was not built for the thing he wanted most. And then, one rainy Portland morning, without any plan or intention, they walked into each other's lives through the most ordinary door imaginable. I do not know what you are carrying today, or what doors you think are close to you, but I hope this story reminds you, the way it reminds me, that ordinary mornings can change everything, and that it is never ever too late to be truly seen. Okay, girls, if this story touched something in you the way it touched me, I need you to do me a favor right now. Hit that like button because it genuinely helps more people find these stories. And more people finding these stories means more of us remembering that we are not alone in what we feel. Subscribe if you have not already because I share stories like this every single week, and I do not want you to miss a single one. And leave me a comment down below. I read every single one, and I want to know. Have you ever had a moment like Margaret did, where one honest conversation changed something in you? Tell me everything. I will be right here, same as always, with another cup of coffee and another story worth telling. I will see you in the next one.